Hello and welcome to another Play Better Chess video. So today I'm going to go over some good habits to improve your chess while also showing you this great game from back in 1878. It was played by two chess masters, George Henry Mackenzie, who was a captain in the Civil War, the United States Civil War, and Captain Mackenzie had the white pieces against James Mason. So this is from 1878. All right, the game starts with e4. So I'm going to discuss, as I show the moves, some good habits to get into. So especially for beginners out there, you want to learn the basic rules and strategies of chess, the many rules of thumb, such as controlling the center of the board. So Mackenzie plays e4, and this controls the center by immediately attacking this square here on d5. So, a good habit to get into is place one or two pawns in the center. If you can't place both pawns in the center, then sometimes you can place maybe one pawn in the center, such as a D pawn sometimes goes out with the C pawn next to it. And if you had pawns there, they would control these squares in the center, here and here. So, placing pawns in the center and controlling the center, a very good habit to get into. And so the game continues with e6. Now, this also covers this square, a central square. So it's good to know that controlling these four squares in the center is a great habit to get into, and to fight for the center the entire game, into the end game, is always a good habit. So the game continues. This is a French defense, by the way. So here we have d4, and another good habit. If your opponent lets you place both of your pawns in the center, two squares forward from the king and the queen, side by side like this, that's a good habit to get into, because now you're controlling all these very important squares in the middle of the board, and you have more space than your opponent. So that's a good habit to get into. Gain more space, because with more space you have more room to maneuver your pieces, and at the same time you're cramping your opponent and limiting the mobility of his pieces. So we have d5 here, the French defense. This is the normal move here, where you bring this pawn up one square, but then you push the other pawn up to counterattack in the center. So if your opponent is grabbing a lot of space in the center, a good habit is to not let them just control everything in the middle of the board. You want to strike back in the center and try and break apart their central pawns. So this pawn is under attack here on e4. And so George Henry Mackenzie, he plays knight to c3, defending it. And another good habit to get into is to get your pieces off the back rank quickly, and usually bring your knights out before your bishops to c3 and f3. Those are usually good squares for the knights because they control a lot of central territory. And it gives you time, by bringing your knights out before the bishops, it gives you extra time to see where you may best place your bishops as the game progresses. So we have knight defending. So another good strategy is when you're attacking a piece or a pawn, and there's only one defender, well, add another attacker. So now you have two attackers versus one, and that forces your opponent to make a decision. Do you defend this pawn, maybe by bringing another piece up? Do you relieve the tension in the center. Let's see what happens. So the tension is relieved here, and the computer says that that is not the best move. If we go back, it looks like e5 would have been better, pushing forward, gaining space, and attacking the knight. So excuse me, I did not want to move that. So let me delete that move. A mouse slip. All right. So the best move according to the computer is to push this pawn forward. And another good habit to get into is to play moves that accomplish more than one thing. And this also points out another thing that you don't usually want to do. You want to get in the habit of not moving pieces and pawns more than once in the opening. Now, another good habit is to always double check moves that you're thinking about, because sometimes all these general rules, they can be broken if you have a good reason to do so. And here, it would be a good reason to move this pawn more than once in the opening, to push it forward here and attack the knight. And it would accomplish more than one thing. It would gain space for white in the center. It would attack this knight, and the knight would have to retreat. And that lets white gain more time and freedom to just develop how he chooses while his opponent is retreating. So we'll go on to the next move here. We have a liquidation of two pawns in the center, so the tension is relieved. And usually it's a good habit to not release the tension in the center, to just keep developing and building pieces up until it's advantageous for you to do so. And sometimes that's hard to determine, especially for beginners. You just have to play regularly. Another good habit, play as much as you can, as often as you can, but go over your games. Just look at them yourself and then go over them with a computer. So you try and calculate what you did wrong first before getting computer help. And that'll help you improve as a chess player better by doing that calculation. All right, a recapture. So things are even as far as the pawns in the center. Both sides have a knight developed. So Mackenzie develops his other knight, the best move in the position. Knights before bishops. So now the knights are helping control the center. What does his opponent do? He develops the bishop here, and this is the best move. Getting the bishop off the back rank, and this allows black to get ready to castle. Another great habit to get into is to castle early and often. Now, a knight developing move could be played, but because, or why this bishop move is best, well, it does multiple things. It attacks the center, and it attacks towards the king side, which is where white will probably castle. It also gets this bishop off the back rank and out of the way of the king and rook so they can castle. And white responds with the same move. Although knight to b5 is best according to the computer to go ahead and attack the bishop. So in doing that, you try and get rid of the bishop pair. So that would have been a good move, bringing the knight up. Once again, moving a piece twice in the opening, which you don't usually want to do unless you have a good reason. And knight to b5 would have threatened to capture the bishop and knock out black's bishop pair. And you want to get into the habit of not giving up your bishop pair unless you have a good reason. Because if you lose one of your bishops and your opponent keeps both of their bishops, then the one that you lost and your opponent has that colored bishop. Let's say you lose your dark squared bishop, but the opponent has that dark squared bishop. He can use that bishop to attack all these dark squares on the board and you won't have a bishop to counter that, so that can be an advantage. And especially if the board opens up, then you definitely want to keep your bishop pair on an open board. Whereas knights would be better if the position was more closed with a lot of pawns blocking things on the board. All right, continuing on, we have castling by black, a good move that gets the king to safety. When you castle, you can only be attacked, straight on or from one side here. There's nothing that can get you from the other side of the board. Whereas if you're in the center, you can be attacked head on from one side or the other. So, all the more reason to castle early and often, get that king to safety behind this wall of pawns and this knight. And this move accomplishes more than one thing. Other than getting the king to safety, your rook is developed towards the center, where it can maybe move here and try and fight for this open e-file. And another good habit to get into is place your rooks usually on open files. So before we continue with the rooks, first the knight is developed, getting it off the back rank. Knights first because they're slower than bishops. So white continues his development of the minor pieces, developing the bishop, pinning it to the queen. So that's a good habit to get into. Look for moves that threaten things. Here we have a pin of this knight to the queen. So, the threat is that if the knight moves, the queen will be captured. So, obviously black probably won't move their knight, but you're limiting your opponent's pieces. Now, they could immediately attack you and force this bishop to make a decision on what it's going to do. But in the game, we had the first mistake here, knight to e7. Now, as I mentioned, you don't usually want to move a piece twice in the opening. So this is a mistake. It would have been better to counterattack here with your own bishop, developing and pinning white's knight to the queen here. So that would have been a better move. And then the computer recommends bishop to e2, breaking that pin. So in the game, knight to e7 occurred. So what does white do? Well, white gives up the bishop pair, and this is a great move here because now normally you don't want to give up your bishop pair unless you have a good reason. And the good reason here is that after capturing, white has wrecked the pawns around his opponent's king, creating weaknesses. Weak isolated doubled pawns here, a weak isolated pawn here, an open G file that can be maybe used to attack. But then again, if the king were to go into the corner and the rook on f8 moves here, it could be a counterattack against white's king. So let's see what happens here. The knight jumps forward, another great move. This knight kind of gets out of the way of the queen, so the queen has access to this diagonal to help in the attack on the king's side. So it looks like the opponent responds with king to g7, which the computer says this is an excellent move, but knight to g6 would have been better. Immediately attacking and trying to get rid of this knight that's over here hovering around the king's side. So the game continues with the queen jumping into action, the best move. And something else you want to get in the habit of doing is you don't want to bring your queen out too far. Like here, the queen moved to the 5th rank. Now in this position, this is a great move. It's the best move because it's jumping over to the king's side to help in an upcoming attack against the black king. But in general, a lot of times you want to keep your queen kind of back on the 2nd rank, maybe sometimes on the 3rd rank, where the queen is harder to attack because the queen is one of your your most valuable piece other than the king. So you want to keep that queen protected and not place it where it can be attacked. But getting the queen and the other pieces off the back rank quickly allow you to connect your rooks. So also a good habit to get into is to connect your rooks quickly where they have more mobility and they cover each other. They back each other up. And now you have room to place these rooks on the best files. Usually an open file like this, or if there are any half open files, or behind pawns that you've pushed forward or plan to push forward. Okay, so the game continues with the best move being found here, rook to h8. And of course, that is to stop this attack on the pawn between, or with bishop and queen, threatening a check here. And of course, if we go back one, yeah, this would be a checkmate if the queen were to capture here before the rook moves to defend. So the rook defends, and now we have f4, an inaccuracy. Apparently, g3 is what the computer recommends. So that's pretty interesting. The computer recommends g3 here, but we'll see why Mackenzie did not play this move. Now, why would the computer recommend that? Well, in the future, if a piece, a rook or a queen lines up on the king on this half open G file, this move would block any attacks with bishop and rook maybe. Also, it protects the knight. And you could also push this pawn forward and it'll be backed up by this pawn. And then maybe the rooks would have to fight for the open E file. But let's see what Mackenzie has in mind here, how he continues his attack. All right. He plays f4, blunting the scope of the bishop. And in return, an inaccuracy is played by Mason here. He plays this c6 move, which prevents the knight from jumping forward. It fortifies this pawn on d5 and frees up the knight, to not have to defend it and jump here and counterattack white's knight. But it looks like knight to g6 immediately would have been better. So in the game, after f4, c6, then we have rook to f3, another mistake according to the computer. Knight to e2 is recommended. But this rook is brought up here to help with the attack, and white still has the lead here by about +1.5 almost. Even though material's even, white is ahead, the equivalent of almost 1.5 pawns. So the game continues with the knight blocking, attacking white's knight. So now we have rooks doubling on the f file, and we'll see why this is played in a little bit here. First, the queen, a mistake is made. Knight capturing on f4 would have been better. So a habit to get into to help you improve your chess is when your opponent has a fierce attack building up against you, a lot of times it is a good idea to exchange off the attackers if you can. So that's why that's the best move. Just taking this knight, the queen would probably recapture, of course, and it just knocks out a defender while giving you time to bring up it knocks out an attacker, giving you time to bring up more defenders to help your king. So the game continues with knight jumping to e2, helping to further fortify this pawn, which is under attack by bishop, queen, and knight here. So the game continues with the bishop getting off of the back rank, but apparently the computer likes c5 a little bit better, counterattacking in the middle. But at this point, it looks like Mackenzie is about to close this game out. So how does he do it here? What does he do to finish things off? So the knight jumps up to g3, bringing another attacker to the king side. And it's, the pressure is slowly building up. So how will Mackenzie go about delivering the final attack here? Okay. In the game, rook to g8 is played, with maybe the idea of dropping the king back to here at some point, and having this rook lined up on the opponent's king. But apparently, king to g8 would have been better. So if we go back, apparently that move is better. But at this point, white is ahead by more than +3 anyway. So with that, king to g8, it looks like bringing the knight here would be best. Attacking the bishop. Maybe a threat of a check here, but just slowly improving the position of this knight. Now, another habit to get into is, I may have mentioned it earlier, don't put your knights on the edge of the board. The old saying, a knight on the rim is dim, because the knight has less scope on the edge of the board. As you move the knight into the center of the board, it can move to more squares and cover more area. All right, so let's see what happened in the game. We had this, let me go back a few. So the knight jumps forward. Rook lines up on our king. And then this brilliant move here, a brilliant queen sacrifice. And the only option here, whenever a king is under attack, there's only 3 possibilities. Block, which can't be done when they're side by side like this. So if you can't block, your other option is to run. The king cannot run because he's boxed in by his own pieces, and the queen is covering that escape square. And the final option is to capture the attacker. So just remember, if you're in check or you're about to check your opponent, there's only 3 options. Capture the attacker, block the attacker, or run from the attacker. All right. So in the game, the capture is forced, luring the king up the board. And now we have a mate in 5. So, check out this amazing finish. And here's another great habit to get into. You want to look at moves that may seem ridiculous, especially if they're checks. Before every move, look for checks, captures, and threats in that order. And that's a great habit to get into that'll help you avoid blunders, help you find great moves that you didn't think were possible. So checks, captures, and threats. First, you want to look at checks because they're most forcing. And if you move this queen here, with check, a lot of players, especially beginners, would never think that you're going to just move your queen where it can just be captured. So definitely look at all checks, even if they seem ridiculous, because then you might find this really good check on h6 here. So in the game, the brilliant queen sacrifice, forcing a capture. And then another great habit to get into is if you're going to check, make sure you have a good follow-up after the check. And so the combination begins here with, or the attack, mating attack begins with the best move. The knight on the edge repositions into the center. So that's a good habit to get into. If you have a knight placed on the edge of the board, or if you have to put a knight there, find a way to reroute it back towards the center of the board. So we have a check on the king and recovering the escape square so the king cannot run back to g7. And there's nowhere else for the king to go here. So this is forcing. The knight must be captured. Well, now we have the other knight capturing, delivering a check, forcing the king forward further into enemy territory. So the king is forced to go to h5. And now g4, the best move is played, luring the king even further up the board. And now rook to g3, a great move, attacking the king and forcing the king back. The only move possible. And the final mating move, bishop to e2, ending the game here, trapping the king out on the edge of the board here. So, amazing queen sacrifice, great finish to this game. And that's why I recommend that you take a look at some of the old games. This was played in 1878. The older chess masters didn't have the use of the computers that we have today, but they do still have some brilliant games that they're able to play, especially these talented chess masters of the past. So, check those games out. Get in the habit of reviewing games by the top players, both present and past, and see what you can learn from them. All right, well, maybe in the future I'll have more habits that you can get into to help improve your chess. But for now, feel free to leave any comments. Let me know what you thought of this game, or any other comments that you would like to leave. Please like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.